we're in the studio this morning, we're set up and we are ready to go for our tattoo. We're going to do it with our 10 gauge 3-round liner, so very fine line. My needle and my ointment, whatever ointment I'm going to use, none of this stuff gets open or put out until my client is here. I like for my client to see the fresh needle, the fresh ink being poured, and the fresh inkies being put out just for them.
And then once the client arrives, I have a few different sizes of the design ready for me to stencil so that we can put the design up to the area that she wants to get it, and we can check the size, make sure that we're both happy with it. I need to consider the size of the design, make sure that it's not going to heal badly over time and that all of the lines and details are going to blur too much. So with this particular tattoo, we put the design on the arm and we twisted and moved the arm around to see how the design would move with the arm, and that helped us pick the location of where the tattoo should go. So once we decided, you can see that I clean the area well with my green soap and water. The green soap is diluted. It's about 10 parts water to 1 part green soap. So I'll clean the area, I'll make sure that it's shaved well. Even the really fine baby hairs, it's important to shave those and make sure that the area is well cleaned, and make sure that the hair is gone so that the ink doesn't stick to the hair through the tattoo process. I'm going to mark out where we want the tattoo to go. I'm going to place the stencil over the skin and use my marker to mark the area. This helps me figure out how much stencil stuff to put on, where I need to put my stencil stuff, and it helps me pre-plan where exactly the design is going to go. So once I've got the stencil stuff on the skin, I don't have to overthink it. I can just line it up with my markings and we're good to go. You can see that I don't need much stencil stuff for a tattoo this size. You want it to soak into the skin well. It's going to grip onto your stencil much better. So you can see that it's well rubbed in, but it's still tacky and wet enough that once I put that stencil in place, it's going to grip onto that carbon really well, and I'm going to get a nice strong stencil out of it. I'm going to make sure that the design is flat and that it's not creased and distorted on the skin in any way. And then you need to put a good amount of pressure and leave the stencil for at least 10 to 20 seconds to allow the stencil to be really strong on the skin. And we're doing 2 tattoos today, so we're going to go through exactly the same process on the other tattoo. And when we're placing our stencil, it's very important to make sure that the client is stood in the most natural pose possible. So we're doing this second tattoo on the back of her arm, and the tattoo is going to be mostly viewed when she is stood relaxed, normal. So it's important that we put on the stencil in that way so that it doesn't look weird or distorted when our client is stood in a natural pose. I'm happy with how the stencil looks. All of the detail is there. There's some very small precise detail there, so the stencil needs to be on point. We don't want to have to guess anything, and I'm happy with how this one looks. For my setup, I'm using my Dragonhawk Fold Pro machine. It's got an adjustable stroke on it, and I like using about a 3.9 for any fine line work. And I'll turn the voltage down to about 7 volts, maybe 6.5, but probably 7 volts. It's going to allow me to take my time in the skin with my finer needles, because the finer needles, they're going to penetrate the skin really easily, and it's really easy to go too deep and cause a blowout. So turning our voltage down a little bit is going to help us reduce the damage, and because it's hitting the skin less frequently, it's going to give us a little bit more time in the skin. And if we go back, you can see I take some of my Inkies ointment and I rub it over the tattoo. And I also rub some on the palm of my tattoo in hand. It just helps me glide over the skin a little bit easier and get some control as I'm tattooing. On top of that, the ointment helps soothe the skin throughout the tattooing process and relieve some of the bleeding. And to start off, you can see that I'm not stretching the skin, I'm not overstretching the skin too much. Just stopping it from bouncing up and down. So as I'm pulling my line, I've got control over how deep I'm moving with the needle. If I wasn't stabilizing the skin enough, it's going to be bouncing up and down, and I can't get a clean, consistent line that way. I can't control the depth as I'm moving around the skin if it's bouncing around too much. But that being said, overstretching is a big problem too. If you overstretch, that's going to do too much damage to the skin when the needle is going to tattoo the skin if you're overstretching. So be careful of that too. And the reason I like using long taper needles, especially for fine line work, is because we're not working that deep into the skin. So with a long taper, a long point on the end of the needle, the very end that we're working with in the skin is very precise and very sharp and fine, which is going to help us with our fine line work. It's a little bit bloody still at the top. The bottom half has calmed down a little bit. And because it's so small, I made sure that all of the details, all of the lines, as it ages and blurs, I make sure that nothing is going to age badly and be detrimental to the overall design. Something that's easy to overlook at the early stages of your career, I definitely underestimated how important it is to focus on the tiniest little adjustment in the depth of your needle. It can make a drastic change to the result of your line. It's so easy to go too deep, to not work deep enough, to overwork. So really pay attention to how deep you're working with your needle, down to a fraction of the millimeter, because that paired up with the voltage and your hand speed and the stroke, it's going to really affect the outcome of your lines. And you can see as I've dipped my needle in the ink, I'm just taking off a little bit of that excess ink with my tissue. All I'm doing is dipping the tip of the cartridge underneath the surface of the ink. It's going to pick more than enough up, and I can dab the excess onto my tissue, and that's all good to go. And this is how it looks finished. I've left just enough space for it to heal well in the future, and there's a few white highlights in there to help it on its way too.
The Buzz.